Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Tori Ekstrand from the University of North Carolina, and I'm currently at the University of Tübingen in Tübingen, Germany.
wonderful. And you've got a bookcase behind you laden with classic titles of Tübingen literature.
Not quite, not quite. I'm the classic visiting professor. I'm very grateful to Tübingen and my colleague here, um, Guido Zorstiga, who's helped me to land an empty office for the time being. Although I'm told at any moment, we know what real estate is like in the academy, right? And so you can't be sure if somebody else isn't going to lay claim. And of course, I'm a guest, so I'm happy just to be here. I will move wherever they tell me.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope that they give you a few more minutes today at least.
Yes,
So,
yes.
Prof T, thank you so much for doing this. And I'd like to begin by asking what's currently impeding, dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting you? What's going on?
Yeah. So for me, I'm a First Amendment and free expression scholar and have been for about 25 years now. And then before that, I worked in the journalism industry. So, as you might imagine, my thoughts are always connected to issues of free expression and the First Amendment. And so I suppose, well, not suppose, I am thinking deeply these days about, I would say, four things.
Hmm.
One is the erosion of democratic norms that are eating at the First Amendment, among other parts of our law, right? So
Mhm.
that's one. And then with that, and I would say part of that is the growth of artificial intelligence and the very different ways countries are thinking about this like innovation regulation calculus.
Hmm.
If we're going to agree that that's the calculus to start with, but we can talk about that if we like. Um, so I'm a First Amendment scholar. I care about all things free expression, and I'm especially worried about academic freedom right now. So when I'm not writing about the First Amendment and artificial intelligence issues related to free expression, I am writing or working, I should say, um, with my colleagues at the University of North Carolina on issues of academic freedom. So, of course, the First Amendment supports academic freedom. We can get into that if you want. But we're losing academic freedom, right? And we're
Mhm.
losing it worldwide. And so, what are we going to do about that? Um, it's a daily fight, right? And then because of my background and sort of my history and the school that I'm in at UNC, I also care deeply about press freedom. And I still have colleagues in the industry. I have colleagues who still care deeply about that. And of course, all of these things are kind of interconnected. And we've seen this decline in both press freedom, but just also what I would say is a really vibrant, group of people able to get into this field, right? So anyway, we can explore any and all of that wherever, obviously you want to go.
Well, I wondered if we could go, as they say in baseball commentary, back, back, back. Tell us about your time in the journalism industry. It's clear
Sure.
that you still have some important connections there from what you just said.
Yeah, I guess I have a few. I'm starting to, I think that title of senior scholar creeps up on you and you're like, holy crow, how did I get here? But um, I started out in journalism. I started out in radio news after getting out of the Newhouse School at Syracuse and eventually found myself at the Associated Press in New York City on the senior management team. Oddly enough, as quite a young senior manager. Um, so it's kind of an oxymoron, but I was the baby in the senior management group, working in actually their corporate communications department. So while I had started out in journalism, my professional path ultimately was in promoting, talking about marketing, handling, press inquiries, believe it or not, about the media, and about the AP, at the AP. And this was in the 1990s. So it was a really interesting time, of course, in the history of journalism. Things were declining at that point, but we hadn't quite hit, right, the dot-com bust. And just the huge amount of layoffs in the news industry that were the 2000s. So, but we could see it coming because, the internet was becoming more commercial, or it was making itself commercially known in the 90s. And so, the AP at that time was grappling with what are we going to do about the internet? Do we do anything about the internet? And there were a couple, and at that time I'm a young person and I'm among a group of people who are like, we better do something quickly. Um, and AP did do quite a few things. We can get into that, but it's, has struggled a bit, right? As have other traditional news organizations since then. So it's a great experience for me to be there.
Mm.
Um, Nothing quite like being in New York City and being exposed to journalists from all over the world. And them watching, I got to live vicariously through the people who would come in and out of New York headquarters. It was a terrific time for me.
My assumption has always been that Reuters, AP, etc., whilst suffering, have done okay by contrast with most newspapers
Yeah. They
because
have,
these
they,
services are still required. You need stringers on the ground in places who talk to people and see things and write about them and film them. Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, no, they've done okay, but they are not as large as they once were. They've completely changed their state bureau structures, which for me was, I think, one of the most amazing things, at least for their domestic operations. And I could
Mm.
get into the details if you're interested, but they really changed how they do what they do in terms of who they are serving, right? Because now, we've lost so many newspapers here in the United States and indeed in other parts of the world. And so that made up most of their income. And what has
Mm.
happened, right, in the 30 years or so since I was there is that the income is now mostly made up by, other outside entities, platforms, internet websites, corporations that buy their feed, right? It's a whole host of it's outside the news industry that makes up a good chunk of their revenue. I haven't looked recently at the percentages, and they don't tend to talk about them too publicly because they don't have to. They are a not-for-profit cooperative,
Yeah.
which makes them a kind of actually a really unique structure. And so I'm anyway, we can talk about
So,
that.
so you go from Sinu House School,
Mhm.
as you were saying, or implying, a famous journalism school in Syracuse, upstate New York, to radio reporting to AP, which is quite a jump, quite a significant jump. So you woke up one morning and suddenly you had a PhD and you were a prof?
Well, so that's the tale of the people who guide us along the way, right? Hopefully I'm sure many of your listeners have that person they could name in a heartbeat who's been the most influential in helping to guide their career, right? And so I was very lucky to have a very good mentor early in my career. And I said to him, he was at Newhouse. He was a former station manager for, I'm pretty sure it was WSTM in Syracuse, New York, but he ultimately led the journalism broadcasting department at Syracuse at Newhouse, even though he wasn't a PhD, because there are a lot of professional faculty at
Hmm.
Newhouse. So I said to him, I adored being in school. I was one of those students, and I saw myself eventually back in a university setting. And I said,
Ah. Mm.
what would you do if you were me? And he said, I would go out and work first, find out what this field is all about, then go get your master's in education, so you know what it means to teach, and then get your PhD so you have the security of tenure. And so I followed his plan, the Don Edwards plan, I call it. That was his name. He's gone now, but Professor Edwards offered that advice one day in the Sheridan restaurant in Syracuse, New York, which I'm not even sure exists anymore. But it was one of those, consequential meetings where you listen to the
Mm.
advice of someone you value and you say, I'm following this. So I did. That's exactly what I did. did
That's a
all
good
of those
story.
things.
And okay, so the First Amendment stuff,
Hmm.
as applied to the media and to academia, what were your initial interests in that, and what seems to have changed now that we have a gaggle of Catholic and evangelical supremes who may or may not be as wedded to these concepts as others have been, and where one of the supremes just announced that precedent may not matter in
Well,
cases that come before him?
yeah, well, there's a lot in that question. Where 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 to start? When I initially got interested in studying the First Amendment, well, when I first went off to my PhD program at UNC, I was a Park Fellow. We were very lucky at that time. The Park Foundation, Park Media, were funding PhDs, and so I applied. And what I was interested in that point was actually the history of the Associated Press because I had spent the last couple of years of my career at the AP running the AP's 150th anniversary celebration. And, one of the cool things about working for an old company, well, it has its challenges. When companies are very old, they kind of operate sometimes in an old-fashioned way that can be hard for a new and young person. I did kind of really dig getting into the archives of the AP. And they were mostly all in dark, dank boxes in the basement of 50 Rock. And nobody had been looking at the stuff. And I was like, this is the treasure trove of stuff. Um, I left before the archive there was fully formed, but after I left in 1999, the AP institutionalized an archive. And it does well welcome scholars to come look at it, but it has a kind of an amazing array of stuff in it. And so I was really interested in just history. And what I found in doing that history, and then at the same time, once I got into my PhD program, the copyright wars exploded. So this, it was the age of Napster and Grokster, and the internet was coming into its own. And my students who I was teaching at that time were fascinated, really taken with the whole environment of sharing and remixing online and all of that, and kind of this heady um, time where we thought, the internet was going to democratize the world and we were all going to live happily ever after. Um, so I wound up actually linking the two, believe it or not. And my PhD work was about the AP's legal history. Um, and it's very concerted efforts to actually get an intellectual property right in the facts of news. I won't go down that rabbit hole unless you want to know all the little legal pieces of this, but it was a very interesting sort of cultural moment for AP where it had been its news had been taken by William Randolph Hearst's INS, and they sued in court and ultimately won their case and created what is a very short-term, interesting common law protection for the facts of news for a very short period of time. You get a hot news item and you got that scoop, you have a very limited intellectual
Mm,
property
mm,
right in that scoop. It lasts for all of a hot second these days, but it's still around. It's called the claim of misappropriation. Anyway, but the history part of that, the free speech part of that, the intellectual property part of that was really fascinating to me. And again,
mm.
digging papers was really fun. So that's kind of where I started. And from there, and of course, like I said, I've been around all these, amazing correspondents from around the world, Pulitzer Prize winners, photographers. I mean, people who had been in Rwanda, um, in Croatia. Anyway, like many folks at the AP, I can tell stories, but I won't. I'll let you ask a question.
Getting into the slightly more contemporary moment, going back 3.5 minutes,
Yeah.
the far right in the United States alleged that universities, other than evangelical Christian ones, were dominated by
Yeah.
leftists who wanted to stop people from saying what they really thought about anything,
Mhm.
and that this was a bad thing. going forward 3.5 minutes, these people have passed laws all over the country stopping people from saying things they want to say in universities.
Mhm.
Discuss.
Yeah.
In other
There's
words,
more,
cancel culture, if it existed, has
Mhm.
gone into reverse.
Yeah, there's more than a book in here, right? I mean, there's so much to unpack about what's
Mm.
happened just the last 3 minutes, 3 years, right? 3 decades. Um, Goodness, where to start? I mean, the thing, I guess I could start with where I've got a research project with a former student of mine who's now at App State. Maybe that's a good place to start because it's where
Mm.
I feel some level of expertise, perhaps. And one of the things we were interested in looking at is how that moment in which the right started to talk in the press about what they perceived as this indoctrination going on and this teaching of critical race theory in the schools and how it was in universities, I mean, but also issues in public schools. Um, and how it was harming students and keep in mind like all of this was happening at roughly the same time rate that COVID was going on and that George Floyd had been murdered and the 1619 project had come out. By the way, I was in school with Nicole Hannah-Jones. She was a master's student at UNC at the time while I was a PhD student. And of course, we had tried to hire her at UNC, but this is going down a rabbit hole again. But it's, there's just a whole explosion of things going on at the same time. And that's just a small part of it. That's just one moment of it, right? And where that I think has contributed to this moment. And so
Yes.
my colleague and I were looking at how did the media actually, and the media broadly defined is mostly newspapers in this case, and I
Hmm.
understand criticism there because not everybody's reading newspapers these days. Um, but how are the media covering what was happening with that critique of the academy, right? What were they saying? And what we've mostly found, and we're going back and we're still working on this project. What we found basically was that they were pretty much, and not surprisingly, taking the talking points of these far right actors and not really questioning them and more or less just reporting them and then looking for a comment from somebody in higher education. And that was kind of the end of it without kind of getting into what exactly is critical race theory? Are professors really indoctrinating their students in some way that's harmful? The press, the coverage of this was largely taking the talking points from these far right folks and regurgitating them without a lot of critical insight. And of course, this happens in the press. And given the collapse of the local press in the last 2 decades, it's not surprising that it happened this way. So I'm sort of giving my former field, a little bit of a break here because it's really easy to criticize the press in a moment in which society has just decided it doesn't care about supporting the press. It stopped paying for newspapers, right? And decided, hey, we're getting free online news. Why do I need to support my local paper, right? So we lost all our best journalists, all our best editors. They all left the field, they retired, they're gone. And what's left is primarily my students, newly graduated, who are learning, but have no one or very few people to learn from now, right? So, and they're not being paid well. Anyway, we can talk about that piece. So anyway, this study is, and again, we're still working on it, is pretty critical of the way the press covered it. And this is just one factor, right, in many. But what people largely understood was that this was happening, right? That we had universities, all of them doing critical race theory, all of my colleagues doing critical race theory, and indoctrinating our students in harmful ways. We are going to argue, we're in the process of trying to cement findings to say that this was a moral panic, basically,
Yeah.
right? Were there faculty doing this? Sure, there are faculty talking about critical race theory, teaching that, right? Was this going on in a way that like was somehow harmful to the overall mission of the academy? No. And also, is this something that's actually beneficial to study and to use and think about and critique? Like we critique critical race theory, like we actually do that when we talk about critical race theory or critical legal studies for that matter, right? So anyway, we're still working on this study. We're going back. It's me and my colleague Evan Ringel at App State, and so again, I think it's multi-layered. Nicole Hannah-Jones did an excellent, excellent podcast recently with the New York Times. The podcast is called The Cannonball. If you have not listened to it, I would recommend to your listeners to like go check it out because she does a really good job, not surprisingly, of talking about that moment, like how it all came together. It's basically 2020 and what was happening in the public consciousness. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, I
that
think that's fascinating. It also raises the political economic component to this, of course, which is further ramified by the recent mergers in the bourgeois media, which accrete power not to reasonably decent liberals, but to people like Murdoch, who
and
are,
Yep, and we've got a fractured media environment, right? We have a two-step flow kind of media. I mean, we've got this environment of maybe I grabbed the headlines today, maybe I looked at a reputable source, maybe I had no time to look at the media today. Maybe I'm disconnecting from the media entirely. My
hmm,
colleague Dubing works on that. Like it just is, right? It is not what it was, not that it was great a decade or two ago, but right, it's vastly different and is causing or contributing to some of these problems.
part of that presumably is the media eating themselves. The tendency of so-called journalists to say that all other real journalists are monsters and liars. We've seen a lot of that. It obviously was incarnated initially by Fox News, but has now spread to the point where pseudo journalists are at the center of White House press conferences, and people who are properly educated, decently trained, and working for reasonably credible bourgeois news organizations are sidelined on behalf of far right, in inverted commas, fringe pseudo journalists.
We have a real crisis of trust in media. We've always had trust issues in media, right? But we have a
Mm.
real crisis of trust in media. And honestly, it does connect to questions of the First Amendment, right? Because we've always been a society in the United States that doesn't professionalize its media in any way, like and give folks a credential to say this is a trustworthy
Yes.
news source, right? Because that offends the First Amendment. It means the government is then involved in deciding who's trustworthy and who isn't, and we don't want the government necessarily doing that. On the other hand, it is very challenging for the public to know whom to trust. Hopefully, they are being taught or have gained some media literacy skills in the last couple of years, but not all of them have. And then you're running also up against, right, the issue of confirmation bias, right? Something my political communication scholars study more, my colleagues study more of, this tendency to follow the news and the information that confirms your own beliefs. So you have all of these things going on at the same time. And it creates this tremendous ugly stew of trust issues, disinformation, um, and yeah, and profit seeking, like quick profit seeking. What can I throw up there that's going to get a million views and what kind of clickbait can get me money? So you sadly have that atmosphere. Back 20, 30 years ago, we had that still, but it didn't have quite the same impact, and people kind of knew our traditional, who the traditional media sources were and the ones they were going to check out, right? And to sort of check on the other things they might have heard. And and there were critiques of all of it, but
Mm.
now people are, I don't want to say largely lost, but I think we're in a moment where we're all seeking, reliable sources of information. Um, Not that we didn't, again, 10, 20 years ago, but it's getting harder sometimes to know. I mean, I was just on Facebook and I'm looking at those pictures I see the first thing that shows up in my feed was a picture of the explosion at a South Carolina judge's home yesterday. There was a bombing apparently, right? And I'm looking at this and I'm going, did this happen? Did this really happen? So then, or am I looking at something that's completely fake, right? I don't know because it's coming as a result of um, somebody who has shared another person's feed. Okay, so then I'm scrolling through and I see it again. And this time it's being shared by a colleague. So I'm going, okay, well, this is being shared by a colleague. Probably this is true. But I'm as the information, as the reader, I'm going to have to do some information seeking to go check out, did this really happen? Or
Mm.
is this AI video now? Right now, we have artificial intelligence on top of this. Not only do we have a fractured environment and a political economy that's not in favor of giving us information that's valuable in our daily lives as citizens, but we've got um, artificial intelligence easily handing us fake. I hate that word fake because it's been overused, but handing us complete disinformation.
Fabrications. By the
Yeah.
way, apologies for moving around a lot while we've been speaking, Prof, which you've noticed probably, but our listeners won't. It's because the cats have been involved in a death struggle to take control of the laptop, take control of the electricals, and knock things from my desk.
For the
But they have,
cats, how else would we get through this period in our
oh,
lives?
quite, but they have just grown tired of these exciting enterprises. And so,
We
um,
need the cats.
going back to what you said earlier, so for those interested in the hot news topic, you have a great book about this.
Mhm.
The other major big time book contribution is that there are many editions, I don't know how many, 452 of your textbook on the law and communications.
My colleagues and I, we have I mean, there are a number of, media law textbooks out there, and my colleagues listening right now know, oh, textbook, it's, not our favorite form of work in the field necessarily, but I have really fallen in love with it because, um, well, one, as a senior scholar, right, it keeps us up to date. So we have this textbook, the Law of Journalism and Mass Communication. We inherited it from Bob Traeger, who was at the University of Colorado for many years and the lead author on that text, and he's now retired. But he still has a hand, like we still check in with him. So about things, which is great for all the emeritus professors out there. Like we still need you. It still matters. We may be a senior professor now, but we're still learning. And so we're headed into the ninth edition. We're writing the next edition. Yeah. And the last I heard from Sage, like we're at about 800 programs nationally, the book. So it has pretty wide reach to the extent that our students are reading it. I don't know. We're in an era, your listeners know, where students struggle with the reading. And legal reading is not easy, so we're working really hard this edition to give them everything they need in ways that they can digest, which is a question in and of itself. But there's a lot going on. So I just finished revisions on the copyright chapter, which was sizable, just looking at all the AI cases going on right now.
Okay, well, that seems like a good moment to move towards the artificial intelligence issue, which we've raised a couple of times. And this is something that is very dynamic. I mean, by the time the book comes out, it'll be wrong, I
Mhm.
suspect, which is always the problem with
Oh,
history.
with textbooks, it's so hard. We're on like a 3-year cycle. So,
Right.
and we try to be strategic to wait till the very last minute to cover the topic we think is going to change most between, before we have to go to press. But yeah, there's a lot going on in copyright and AI right now. A ton.
So we've got situations where companies are pressing, for example, the British government to say anything you can scrape is yours, and we'll
Mhm.
forget about copyright protection.
Mhm.
We've got little groups like Mumsnet or Momsnet. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's a very successful, millions of women are on it every day, online resource for recent and ongoing mothers who may feel isolated and so on, where everything that they've ever presented to one another has been scraped, to use the
Mhm.
artless term of the day, and is being reused without their agreement and without any remuneration.
Mhm.
And we've also got, of course, media companies split about
Mhm.
the parts of them that will benefit from this and the parts that won't. So we're right back to the days of audio cassettes versus their parent companies with interest in music publishing, and to those days that you encountered when you were a grad student, namely, the illegal use of material. So in a sense, we're repeating something, but it's dynamic and different and new, isn't it?
Yes, and it's interesting and it relates very much to the work I did early on in my career with the INS AP case from
Mm.
1918. So, you know, yeah, so where to start in that? Like, so intellectual property and in particular copyright law, as your listeners probably know, right, um, gives rewards to creators for the work that they produce. But it's mostly rewarding the original expression that the authors and creators come up with. And you
Mhm.
cannot, most copyright laws across the world, you cannot claim a copyright in a fact or an idea, right? That's part of what copyright scholars call the public domain. Like you need stuff to draw on. You need a raw toolbox to actually create new works. And so taking what's in the public domain to create a work is okay, right? Or generally not considered to be an infringement of copyright. If you are infringing somebody else's copyright, it has to be substantially similar to the original work, and in at least in U.S. law. And AI is kind of this weird case, right? Because yeah, we've got two issues with, or I mean, there are multiple issues, but there's two big issues, right? The one big question is, does AI violate copyright laws in the process of training, they call it, right? Training um, someone's intellectual property. Like, is that in and of itself a type of infringement? And courts are wrestling with this right now. We have some courts saying yes, some saying, still grappling, right? We don't have like a definitive case. My guess is at some point, at least in the US, this will make itself to the Supreme Court. I don't want to think about it. So yeah, is that and I think for like the Mums Net group you mentioned, yeah.
Mm.
I think one of the frustrating parts isn't, I mean, it is about the fact, hey, I created this stuff and you're training on it. Um, it's this idea that that was my blood, sweat, and tears that I poured into this, right? It's in some ways it's less about the content because ultimately, right, what AI produces looks often very different in many cases, not always, but it's getting better. And what it produces on the output side is very different and not substantially similar to what it trains on. So people who are arguing and saying this is a copyright infringement because it's training, it's like it's hard to say that because what it ultimately produces is usually and often, not always, but usually and often very different than what the creator produced. So what is it that we're upset about? We're upset about this isn't fair, right? I put my time, my labor, and my effort, but copyright law is not about time, labor, and effort. However, in US law, this INS versus AP case is about time and labor, believe it or not. It's about what's a part of unfair competition law, right? That you're unfairly taking my stuff and my hard work and profiting from it. You're reaping where you haven't sown, basically, is one of the famous quotes from the INS case, the AP case. So, um, hmm, in US law, we're like, well, we might give you something for that claim if we agree that that claim is even valid. You're not going to get a ton of money for an unfair competition claim, usually. And in a lot of cases, courts throw it out, and there's a long reason. There are lots of technical reasons why that is. In other parts of the world, like in the EU, it's interesting. They've always and I think this is right, the human rights perspective that is much more deeply entrenched in the civil law system of Europe, because we're the common law system, well, at least the EU, the common law system over in the United States. Um, there is this sense that actually human labor matters, right? The human rights in this matter. And so they do have different laws in different contexts around the EU and in the nation states that say, oh, this is a problem. You're infringing, you are um, unfairly capitalizing on someone else's labor. So these cases are ongoing, and going to see different outcomes in the US versus places like, for instance, the EU, where I am now. Um, then there's the copyright claim on the other side. There's like, is what it ultimately produces, the AI, an infringement? And the answer to that is it depends. It depends ultimately on what, like whether in that particular case is what's produced substantially similar to the original content. And the New York Times is arguing against OpenAI, and that case is ongoing, that indeed what they did produce was substantially similar. We'll see what the court says about that. But the AI is getting so much smarter that it's able to produce stuff that doesn't look like the original, but is still drawing from it. So there's a huge question of unfair competition here. And I think, and we're in the US, we need to be thinking more about that. I would argue as scholars, I'm going to try to write on this once I'm done with my other work, my other projects that need finishing, as we say.
And some of this, I guess, is about the difference between plagiarism and paraphrasing
Yeah. Yes.
and attribution.
Yeah, it's an ethical issue, right? And that's a little bit different than the legal issue that copyright presents.
Yes, but
In
they're
Europe.
related to that is
Mhm.
this concept, very complicated, that I've always loved and wished were more universal around the world, namely fair use.
Yes.
Can you explain to us a little bit what fair use is? Because some of my attorney friends say to
Mhm.
me that they think theoretically it may be boundless.
Yeah, yeah. So fair use is, at least here in the United States, right? I'm not in the US, but in the US, we call it fair use. In parts of Europe, it's called fair dealing. It has
Yeah.
kind of different terms depending on, which continent you're on, which legal system you're looking at. But the idea is, we wanna reward creators and authors for their work and allow them to gain remuneration for their efforts in an effort to like encourage them, right, to do more works, right? And that this is good for progress. This is what the Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution says, right? This is to advance the progress of the nation in the useful arts, inventions, right? It's anyway, you can all look up Article 1, Section 8. Um, so, that is the main idea that's driving, that's like the engine of copyright. But you asked about, say again, I'm sorry, I'm like
Fair
kind of lost.
use.
Oh, yeah, fair use. So, but with fair use, the problem with saying, yeah, I've got this copyright, and Toby, you want to take something from my book, you got to get permission from me and my publisher every time, right? That really works against the idea of free expression, and in the United States, the First Amendment. It really it hurts that. And so one of the things that Congress in the United States, the US Congress did in 1976, but had worked on it for easily 2 decades before it finally got to a revision of US copyright law, is to put into statute a fair use piece, which essentially says that you can use another person's work without asking them. And that this is kind of the safety valve, the free expression safety valve. Because, if every time I have to, I want to use somebody else's copyrighted work. I have to get permission. We'd be living in a crazy permission culture all the time, and lawyers would be making more money than they're making right now. Um, Although Larry Lessig, my colleague at Harvard, always has famously said fair use is is basically a part of the law that means you always have to call a lawyer. Um, because it's tricky. It's tricky. There are four parts to it, and you can run the analysis on your own and say, yeah, I think what I'm about to do is probably a fair use. But the truth is, it's what we call an affirmative defense to a copyright infringement claim. And so you don't really know whether something is fair until a court tells you it is. So in the meantime, you're acting on the advice of attorneys and past cases and all of that. So there are four factors, which I can run through if you want that quick lesson. Okay, so let's see if I can do this without my notes in front of me. The purpose and character of the use. Like, what are you actually doing? Like, are you engaging in a commercial or non-commercial use? Or are you, with factor one in the US, significantly transforming the work? If you are significantly transforming the work in some way, the original copyrighted work, courts will generally say that's a type of fair use. And indeed, the Second Circuit said in the pretty well-known Google Books case that when Google took all of our books, for my academic friends listening, and scanned them all from the University of Michigan and several other big libraries, um, that this was a fair use because they were completely transforming what was the library. They were making it searchable. By the way, they were also not, you couldn't get access to the whole book, right? You're getting access to part of the book. And they're putting it online and your book is actually going to be found because people don't go to the library anymore, right? So there was an idea that it was, that was significantly transformative. So purpose and character of the use. Um, let's see, the nature of the copyrighted work. Factor two, is it fiction or nonfiction? Generally fictional works get more copyrighted protection than nonfictional works. So the courts will look at that. How much you take, the amount and substantiality part of the test. If you're taking a lot of somebody's original copyrighted work, you're probably going to wind up in trouble. That's not going to be fair use. If you're taking just a little, generally you're okay. However, if you're taking the heart of the work and it's a little bit, that might not be good for factor three. Courts might still rule against you. And the last one is factor four, which says the market effect on the original work. If I take your work, Toby, and it totally puts you out of business, or nobody's going to buy your book because they're going to buy what I just did because I stole or took a lot of your work, that factor will fall in your favor. So courts take those four factors. Yeah, they're not odd numbered. So, and they weigh them together in these
Into
cases.
account. Yeah.
And they come up with their own kind of internal calculus. None of this is certain,
I
right?
had a
A
case
risky thing
where
to
a
go to court.
company, a big media corporation, wrote to me saying, it's come to our attention that your book has, 50 photographs that are stills of production of a television series that we now own. And the stills had come from a publicly available library and had been handed over by the people who'd taken the production stills to
Mhm.
this library, which was also the publisher of my book. We reserve the right to sue your ass because you're without permission using these photographs. However, your book has been reviewed in the New York Times, and as a consequence, this has helped to bring more attention to our property. For that reason, for the time being, and while we see this as to our commercial advantage, go right ahead, dude. But if we find that it's not to our commercial advantage, look out. Get on
Look
it
out.
directly to
That
Mexico.
That's quite a C&D letter. So cease and desist letters are really popular in the copyright world and among intellectual
But
property lawyers. Like,
but it was cease
oh,
and desist, maybe.
maybe. Yeah.
It's a, for now, we think we might make a little bit of money out of your ridiculous academic work.
Just watch yourself,
So
Toby.
just be careful, dude. And
Watch
in
yourself
the
there.
nearly 30 years since,
Yeah.
they
Well,
have
I think all academics have a story related to fair use for sure and copyright. My own was that I had taken a chapter that was I had taken actually a book that was completely out of print, and I copied it and I put it up on a learning management system. And this was before learning management systems, like Canvas and Moodle and all these,
Mm,
online systems
mm,
we use. Was before they had the type of AI that can even suss that out. Because, a lot of those um, programs now can tell, like, that you're putting copyrighted works up there. And so, so a fair use for an academic might be a scan of one chapter. Roughly, it's not a perfect calculus, but certainly a whole book. I argued, yeah, I got a cease and desist letter. Somehow they found out. I don't know if a student tattled on me or what, but I thought, it's out of print. I'm probably okay. And I had like 10 people in this seminar, but um, anyway, so usually what happens is they don't go take you to court right away. Usually what they do is they send you a nice warning letter, and that's what I got. Please take that down. And so I was like, sure, I'll take it down. So I guess
I'm,
I learned my lesson, but
as Robert De Niro would say, I'm very fucking sorry.
yes, right. It's like,
Um,
well, your book is out of print. What am I? Well, you're still supposed to go back to the publisher and get permission. So, and this was before our libraries had, all of our university libraries now have a pretty good system. It's, not perfect, but most of us can go to them for help to get the permissions we need to put stuff in our
and
Canvas.
I want to go back to a couple of earlier pieces that you wrote from more than a decade ago, I think,
Oh boy.
about disability access.
Yeah, I get kind of interested in this. Well, the thing that has, I mean, I'm kind of interested, like a lot of First Amendment scholars, I've been thinking a lot about my colleagues, and, some of us really will sit in one area for a while, like maybe we're really into access for information, or we're interested in the intersection between copyright and the First Amendment, or we're interested in privacy intersections with the First Amendment. The First Amendment has impacts on other parts of the law. But I think what inevitably happens is we're kind of interested in the whole thing. We're interested in where it is that courts draw lines restricting expression, because there are always, there are barriers on free expression in the United States, despite what, you know, some people might say. We do have limitations. And I'm also interested in the carrots too, that sometimes government has the capability to hand out to encourage expression and to pull more people in and to
Mm.
make the marketplace of ideas, our famous metaphor that we use all the time, more inclusive. Like, how many people are we pulling into the marketplace? So I think I have that on my bio, that I'm fascinated by that. How do we actually define what the marketplace of ideas is, and then who gets included and who doesn't? And so I began to look at, and it was a hot topic at the time, still is, um, this idea of online accessibility as part of, something that should be protected by the First Amendment, because our entire lives now, right, run by this thing, and I'm holding up my smartphone. Like, how do you do family life? How do you do banking? How do you do your job? How do you, oh my goodness, get around a city or a municipality or find my bus home or whatever? I think all of this, our lives are now very much and obviously connected to our smartphones. And for people with disabilities, they are and have been losing access to public life because many of the programs and apps that are out there don't consider their needs. And they're getting, they're already excluded on the basis of, their social status in society. Like, oh, he's in a wheelchair. What do I have in common with him? And now, they have other limitations when it comes to accessing information online. So for me, it was a question of access, and a question of inclusion. So I tried to talk about some of the values um, that we connect with the First Amendment, some of the theory we connect with the First Amendment, and tried to get into some of the case law. Most of the case law around this, though, connects to violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it connects, it like intersects with other law that's not First Amendment related, but I was kind of interested in saying, you know what, we really need to think of this more as a human right issue as much as it is a statutory issue, like an ADA violation. So most of us in the academy now are used to getting those notices about making sure our online sites are accessible, or hopefully we have at UNC, I think we do a pretty good job. We've got people who help us make sure our content is accessible to our students, but it's not just in the university environment, it's everything.
And
And
Prof, I have one more question for
yeah,
you.
sure, sure.
And once you've engaged that, I'd like to throw the ball back to you in a sense and
Mhm.
give you a chance to add anything you wish. And that might take the form of going over terrain we've already traversed, where you just want to pop some more ideas out there, or it
Mhm.
might be something that we haven't discussed where you want to
Yeah.
make mention. Yeah. So my
Mhm.
last question is this: Stanley Fish, down
Yes.
the road from UNC,
Mhm.
famously wrote, "There's no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing too."
Yeah.
Normally, I'm not a Fish fan, but I think this is quite a good piece. And in it,
Mhm.
one of the arguments is that the only place where there should be just about absolute free speech is the seminar.
Is where, I'm sorry, I
The
misspelled that.
seminar.
Oh, the
Because
seminar.
in the
Yeah.
seminar, you can more or less be certain no one's going to attack or steal from anybody else.
Mhm.
And there is a system whereby there is a person chairing the seminar, normally the professor, who can say,
Mhm.
hang on a minute, let's think about the feelings of others in the room. But also,
Mhm.
others in the room can say, this affects me because of my parents, my background, my whatever.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
all parties can make their case. But in other contexts, it frequently doesn't work. It's not
Mhm.
something that US employers acknowledge. There's no right to free speech when you're
Mhm.
a worker.
In a private forum, no.
No.
No, and,
Um,
and most Americans do not understand the limitations of free expression. That's
there are
at
all
least as
kinds
the
of limitations.
Americans define it, you
You,
know.
you know, if you stand up in a movie theater and you say fire, and that
Mhm.
leads to a misallocation of public resources, you do not have the defense of free speech. There are all sorts of debates about what is speech. From
Mhm.
1915 to 1952, motion pictures were not protected, for example.
Mhm.
Now they
Mhm.
are. So it
Mhm.
seems to me this concept is so rubbery, so
Yeah.
subject to historical contingency, that the
Yeah.
First Amendment absolutists are
Yeah.
always on shaky ground.
Yeah, they're always on shaky ground. I think one of the things, I guess there's a couple of things there. I like I think I'm always, now that I've spent 25 years, studying case law, me and my colleagues, like we have an idea of at least what the courts have told us it is in the United States. Now, whether that's what we want as a society or not, right, is another question. And it's fun to wrestle with that in class. I will say, like, is this a good decision? Like, does this serve our free speech interests or not? Do you think this serves democracy or not? And of course, I'm thinking here prior to, the last couple of years, but anyway, we can get into the politics of the court because I think that's the other piece of this, right? And I think Fish points this out as among other scholars too, is that speech at its core is a political act. And so, to try to isolate it as something that can be somehow neutral and cabined as being neutral, by the law is a really challenging thing.
Mm,
That said, I think we want free expression, right? We want to encourage it and we want it to happen. And yes, the classroom's a great place for it. Um, but there are always going to be some limitations, as you pointed out, and as the law tells us. And then the big question always is who is defining what the limitations are? Who has the power in that, right? Is it me, the teacher? Is it my administrators? Is it the Trump administration? Like, who has the power in that? And we're always trying to exert our power over other people's speech, whether it's with our family member in a text exchange this morning or like like or in the classroom or in the in public debate. Like, this is the normal course of human interaction. We just do this. So when we put laws around this, which are hopefully helpful, the question always has to be, what are those laws serving? Are they serving
mm,
democracy? Are they serving this kind of just freedom. What does that mean, right? And so, um, yeah, I mean, it makes for great conversations in class. Like, what is it that we're really trying to achieve with a canon of, free speech cases, particularly from the Supreme Court? Where does it take us? And the truth is that it changes over time. My mentor was always fond of saying, like, it's very intimately tied to history and historical circumstances and context. I mean, this is the critical piece of it, right? Like the Warren Court had a very different strain of free speech jurisprudence than we're seeing right now, obviously, right? So, context, historical context matters. And we want free speech for cats too. Which one was?
That was Chinguri, which he's a Basque. He migrated here from Spain with me. Chinguri means ant in English, and it's pretty weird, even by Basque standards, to name a cat after another species. But that was your name, darling. But now he's naranja because of his color. Prof, got about 5 minutes left. Is there
Okay.
anything you want to add? As I
Yeah,
said,
I
it
mean,
could be about something already discussed, or it could be new material.
yeah, I mean, it's related, right, to this whole discussion, and it is about the work of who I assume to be most of the listeners here who are academics, right? And so we don't think about, we don't always, most of us don't spend our days thinking about the First Amendment in relation to academic freedom, but we are now,
Mm-hmm.
right? We are now. And so, and here's another instance where when I think about the fact that the American public doesn't understand a lot about the boundaries and the freedoms associated with the First Amendment, its history and all the case law. Um, oh my goodness, my colleagues. Should I stop for a second?
No, keep going. Sorry,
Okay. Okay.
I'll just silence my.
Okay. My colleagues, whom I adore, haven't really understood the boundaries and the rights that are attached to academic freedom as a part of something that is protected by the First Amendment, right? And why is that? It's not because they don't want to, it's because they've never been exposed to that. Can any of us with uh, terminal degrees, with PhDs,
Por acá, ¿no?
say,
Sorry, Prof. It's
yeah, go
just
ahead.
I have
Yeah.
no hot water.
Oh, goodness. Do you
I
have
have
a person in the house helping you?
two just arrived. The
Okay,
two
I can start over. Do you want to go help him and
No,
then come back?
no, no, not at all. I think this is all part of the artisanal podcast. It's part of real life. There's been almost virtually no hot water for weeks, in that what I do is I have to use D2 batteries to
Oh
get
my
the
God.
hot water going, if you can believe it. And they
Wow.
last a day. And this is clearly absurd. So I've been making a noise and complaining about it. Sorry,
Okay.
Prof. Please finish your thought, and then
Okay.
we're almost concluded anyway.
Okay. The main thing I wanted to say, so my colleagues who are amazing, um, but really all of us in the academy really know very little about our own history and know very little about its connection to academic freedom and the power to do the work that we now do, or at least have been able to do up until this point. And not knowing that history and not knowing the extent and boundaries of that freedom, because most of that has just been understood and normatively driven between administrations and faculty for a long time now, with a lot of things just taken for granted that it would be there. So no need to know it. Now we need to know it, right? We need to know, well, what parts of the First Amendment actually do protect academic freedom? And what is this thing, academic freedom and shared governance? What is that all about? How does it work when it works well? I think we know what it looks like when it's not working well, but we don't really know what it looks like when it's working well. And we've got this kind of balance of power that is hopefully serving um, the research enterprise, but especially serving our students and the public. And this is a part that, because we don't know this, and then we've been attacked and our money taken away, we are scrambling, right? Now, fortunately, we have a lot of people working really hard to push back. I am involved with the American Association of University Professors in North Carolina. I have been active trying to help get people legal representation when they need it, and just kind of doing my part. But I just encouraging all of us, and especially our colleagues, to be watching this, to know that history, to be engaged, you know, and to think about the power of collective action in this, because there's no way any of us individually or one court case is gonna be
Fix
able
it,
to survive this, right? This is a group effort.
especially when there's this 6-3 majority in a particular court in a particular country.
Yeah, well, there's that, but there is just the fact that we don't have, at least in the United States, protections for academic freedom in any part of in any statute. Now, I'm here in Germany in part. I've got a couple of different projects going, but I'm here in Germany in part because I'm interested in the fact that the Constitution here, as a result of World War II, has uh, an academic freedom clause in it. Now, it hasn't been tested too many times, is my understanding, but I'm fascinated by this because it is very explicit given what happened to German academics during the war and leading up to the war, especially. So, we could stand to learn from that history.
Prof T, I thank you so much for your time. Your work is great. And I have to thank your mentor, because it's clear that this question of history that he bequeathed you, as it were, as something to think about, is still impelling your work. But the great thing about your work is that it is equally concerned with history and contemporaneity. I thank you so, so much for being with us. It's been great.
Thank you. Very fun. Thank you.